Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercouris in London, and we are very happy and very honored to have with us once again on the Durand, Colonel Jacques Baud. Colonel Baud, great to have you with us. How are you doing today? Where can people follow your work? I have a link to your book on Amazon in the description box down below.
Thank you very much for having me again on your program. That's a pleasure. I quote the Durand here and there when I'm interviewed by even other channels, because you keep being my reference when we talk about analysis and understanding what's going on in the world today. So thank you to invite me again.
It's great to have you with us. And before we get started, let's say hello to everybody that's watching us on Odyssey, on Rockfin, on Rumble, YouTube, and the Durand community on Locals, the Durand.locals.com. And also a quick thank you to our amazing moderators, Peter, Zariel. Thank you for moderating. Very much appreciated. Alexander, Colonel Baud, we have to discuss Ukraine and the news that we're going to have, according to Bloomberg, some sort of unveiling of the Trump plan during the Munich Security Conference, February 14th to 16th. Interesting date that they picked, by the way. Anyway, Alexander, Colonel Baud, let's talk.
Okay.
Indeed, sir. Indeed, so can I just say, first of all, I mean, it's interesting that we're going to have to wait a further week to get this peace plan. It's taking an awful long time to appear. But anyway, we'll no doubt talk about that later. First of all, can I just say that it is a huge pleasure and an honor to have Colonel Baud here again on this program. And for me, personally, if there has been an outstanding military commentator about the war, somebody who's actually explained to me this war better than anyone else, it is Colonel Baud. I speak as somebody who has no military background whatsoever, as I've said many, many times. But reading his book, and I think it is an indispensable book, it has made me understand certain important things which people miss, and that is that the Russian army thinks and fights in a particular way. And in order to understand it, you have to look at what the Russian army is about. Now, if you do that, all sorts of things, which all sorts of people, all kinds of commentators, even some commentators, I take seriously and listen to, things that they say, which they don't find easy to explain and understand, it all becomes much clearer. And I'm also going to say something. If you have read Colonel Baud's book, if you have followed his commentary about the Ukraine war closely, commentary which, by the way, began before the start of the special military operation. I've been reading his works for years now. You would not be surprised in any way that we are where we are now. In fact, I don't know of anyone who has got the underlying realities of this war and its outcome and the position that we are in more correct than him. So I want to make all of those points, and I do want to again stress, please do read his book if you really do want to understand the thinking and the nature of what is now increasingly being recognized as one of the most powerful armies and militaries in the world, then please do read his book. Now, having said all of that, I think the first point to begin, Colonel Baud, other than to welcome you again on this show, is to ask you just about your comments about the situation today. I mean, I've expressed my own views about this to some extent, but perhaps you could tell us what you see as the situation that we're looking at now.
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words, and again, happy to be with you on your program. Now, to go to the question you asked, I think, first of all, everything we see today was absolutely predictable because we knew since, in fact, the very beginning of the special military operation that the Ukrainians could not achieve any kind of victory. And this is exactly what we are seeing unfolding today. The problem is, what I think the only question that remains open today is to what extent we will see or to what extent or how big will be the defeat of Ukraine. I think that's the only question we have. And I think that's the reason why you have so many countries today, even European countries, that realize that they are in dead ends with this conflict. And they try to find a way out. Because the idea of pressing Ukraine to fight against Russia, and again, that was obvious. I mean, in spring, that was May, June 2022, Zelensky said that from that point on, he was depending, I mean, Ukraine was depending on European aid to survive. That was May, June 2022. And he knew from, and I think that comes from an interview he gave to CNN on March 2022, probably the 20th or 22nd of March 2022. He said that he asked the Americans whether or not he would join NATO. And he asked for a frank answer. And he said to CNN, the answer was clearly no. Ukraine will not be member of NATO, but for the public, the door will remain open. Meaning that Ukraine is living on a narrative. We knew that Ukraine was living just with Western aid. I mean, military support, financial aid, and everything you can put under that label. But it could not achieve victory. So, in fact, what we are seeing today is something, it's just the evolution of what we had in May, June 2022. There is nothing changed for Ukraine. They know they will not be member of NATO, despite all the rhetoric we heard, because at the end of the day, as you pointed out several times in your programs, when we talk about NATO, in fact, we should talk about the US, because NATO is simply the US armed arm of its foreign policy. Everything is defined. I worked 5 years in NATO. I was the only Swiss working in NATO based on a special agreement between Switzerland and NATO, because Switzerland is part of the Partnership for Peace. And in that context, I got a position in NATO. And I have seen that basically nothing happened in NATO without the US. This is simply not thinkable to have anything happening without the approval of the US. So US, basically, when the US said to Ukraine, you will not be member of NATO, that means they will not be member of NATO. So everything we have heard since then is just a narrative, is just a plain words, period. And on the military situation, we have seen the situation degrading day by day. And you know better than me all that, because you made very extensive description of what's happening on the battlefield every day. So this is exactly what we had. And we could anticipate that because, first of all, the Russians have also said that. I mean, they have, I mean, the Russians have understood the reality of the situation extremely soon. And that also speaks for very, let's say, effective intelligence in understanding the situation that the West has not demonstrated in any way. But the Russians have understood the situation, and they have said, well, if you help Ukraine, basically you will never achieve the superiority that is required to win against Russia, meaning that the result is that we will simply just grind down Ukrainian forces until there is nothing left. And remember the two objectives that were defined by Vladimir Putin on the 24th of February 2022, basically demilitarization and denazification. We can argue on the word denazification because it's something he took from the Potsdam Declaration of 1905. But in any case, the name of the game was to destroy a potential threat, as it was clearly explained in the address of this 24th of February. But and that's exactly what the Russians have done, and they knew this was almost mathematically that would happen almost mathematically, and that's exactly what happened. So there is no real surprise for those who have been cautious observers and critical observers of the conflict. What's happening today is absolutely no surprise. What surprises me is that we have now the Western world, basically, because even Trump, they are discovering the scope of the conflict. We'll probably come back to the issue of Keith Kellogg and all that, but Keith Kellogg did not really understand the scope of the conflict, what the conflict was about. That's the reason why we have, I think, right now this kind of readjustment in the approach. I mean, in the Trump administration approach to the conflict. So and of course the Europeans, because the Europeans were just into a kind of ideological approach to the conflict, and they refused any kind of understanding. I mean, reasonable or rational understanding of the conflict. And today, what happens is that the gap between the reality and the narrative is apparent. That's exactly where we are in the moment. And the problem for the West today is, how do we fill the gap? Because we have said this and this, Russia is weak and a wash machine. I mean, all this kind of narrative we have heard in the last. And today, everything appears to be exactly the opposite of what we said. Now, how can you build a peace based on so fallacious narrative? And that's where this is the whole issue today, is how do we bridge the gap? And that probably explains why Trump was not able, although it was probably a rhetorical figure, to solve the problem in 24 hours. That was, I mean, I take it as a rhetorical figure. But anyway, we could have expected much more quick results in this the discussion with the Russians, or even with the Ukrainians, by the way. But this didn't happen. And if we have to wait an additional week to have a more detailed image of what Trump wants to do, that means that nothing were ready before. That means that exactly what and where we hear Trump coming with the rare earth and rare minerals and all that, that means that something is not exactly what he expected to be. And that's exactly what the strange situation in which we are today. That's my rough assessment, understanding of the situation.
I think it's a very complete one. Can I just start by going back to your very first point, because you're absolutely correct. I mean, the war was started. I mean, the real war, the one that truly began in June 2022, when the West started to arm Ukraine in a big way, and they started to seek military victory. That it was based upon a false narrative that Ukraine will one day join NATO. You're absolutely correct about this. Zelensky has said this. I don't think it is even disputed in the United States, actually. What is incredible to me, and I still find it astonishing, is that you wage war on the basis of a narrative. I mean, a narrative is by definition a construct of the imagination. I mean, it's something you fantasize and think about. I had always assumed, and I'd assumed that military officers in the Pentagon, in Whitehall, in the Ministry of Defence in London, in those sort of places, that on especially something like waging war, would actually look at the hard, real facts. And I still find it incredible to believe that we could have got into a conflict with Russia, because we are involved in a conflict with Russia. Russia, of all countries, a country with a military reputation that goes back centuries, and which is also a nuclear superpower, on the basis of a constructed narrative that the people who were spinning already knew was false. I've never heard of a situation like that, certainly since the end of the Second World War, to this extent. And it seems to me, coming back to what you say, yes, you can absolutely, and if you go to your book, by the way, just to say again, you can see how mathematically, and one of the interesting things for me was how mathematically minded the Russian military actually is. Just quickly add that. But you can see mathematically how the military outcomes would lead us to the point that we are in. But when you're creating false narratives, you are going to be, from the moment the war begins, running away from those mathematical realities. And I just don't understand how the militaries in the West allowed it to happen. Why they didn't come and say to the politicians, look, what you are trying to do simply cannot work.
Well, I think I absolutely agree with you. I think the military, in fact, if we look carefully, I'm not mentioning the European military because we can say it's inexistent. But remember that even the Pentagon, early November 2023, suggested Zelensky to initiate some talks with the Russians, meaning that, and we have seen that constantly, even if for obvious reason, the Pentagon has not been a moderate element in this conflict, but at least it tried at some point to have be a kind of a moderate factor. What strikes me is that I have been for several years, was a military advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland. And what strikes me is the total absence of the foreign affairs and the diplomacy at large when we talk about the solution of the conflict, meaning that what we are seeing today seems to take the Western and especially European diplomacy on the back foot. I mean, these guys have absolutely not considered any alternative to the narrative. I could understand that some fanatics, I mean, people like Mark Rutte and Ursula von der Leyen, these are fanatics. I mean, simply they are just, or Kaya Kallas, they're just blinded by the hate of Russians. This is just obvious. I mean, Kaya Kallas is part. This is almost the national culture in those countries, Baltic states, Poland, to hate the Russians, and there are probably some historical explanation for that. And okay, why not? The thing is that the whole of the diplomatic apparatuses in Europe in particular in my country, which is a neutral country, have not addressed any option for an alternative a narrative to the situation. They all followed the script that was written by I don't know whom. That is what we call the narrative, without considering any other options of the situation. I mean, the idea that a good friend of mine actually was the Swiss ambassador in Kiev. I mean, the two of them, even the actual one, but the one who was at the beginning of the conflict and the one who is now in Kiev are two good friends, Claude Wild and the other one, I just forgot the name. But in any case, these guys, when they appeared in public media to make their comment on the conflict, they follow exactly by the slightest data. They follow exactly the narrative on the conflict. And for instance, I was surprised to see when we, in November 2022, my friend, again, ambassador in Kiev at the time, he said, we cannot impose the Ukrainians a solution for the conflict. They have to say their words, and we cannot come behind and say, don't do that. But that's exactly what the Europeans did in April 2022. So how can he say that, knowing that the Europeans have done exactly the opposite? And that goes beyond the fanaticism, and that questions the not just the quality, but the ability of our leadership to address questions as complex as this one. By the way, we have very similar issue when it comes to the conflict in Palestine. So this is a very strange situation where we are not driven by facts, but driven by narrative. And the whole apparatus, without any exception, follows the narrative. The Swiss intelligence service just issued his report on the security of Switzerland for 2024. In this document, which is supposed to outline the problems and the challenges for the security of Switzerland last year, but that obviously applies for this year again also, there's absolutely no no change with the narrative that we hear in the papers. Even if we know that there is so wrong things that have been said about this conflict and wrong assessment and wrong understanding that lead us exactly into the situation we are and leads the Ukrainians in the situation they are. So there's absolutely no understanding. So why is that an intelligence service? I mean, it's not an intelligence service at all. This is just putting together the headlines of the papers and making a report. It's not an assessment. But that shows that the whole of the establishment has followed una voce the narrative without questioning any part of it. And today we are exactly in that push the situation, the Western leadership at large into a situation where we're in a dilemma, because how should we follow the narrative or should we follow the reality? And if we follow the reality, we know perfectly that, as Narishkin said a few days ago, Ukraine will just cease to exist. So it's a.
I mean, I think I just want to say I think it's perhaps useful to point out how absolutely bizarre the narrative has been, because for the first year and a half of the war, the dominant narrative was that Ukraine was going to win. I mean, we had article after article, commentary after commentary, statement after statement, saying that the Ukrainians were winning the war and that they were going to achieve a victory, and that the offensives that they launched in the autumn were decisive, and that the defense of Kiev had been the heroic victory, and that the summer offensive in 2023 was going to break through and achieve an even greater victory. And of course, it was completely otherwise. Again, if this is not said from hindsight. I want to say this again. I was reading you at the time. I remember reading at the time. You were pointing out that this is all wrong, which it was, and it was obvious why it was wrong. But that was the dominant narrative. Every political leader in the West was parroting it. The militaries were supporting it, and then from about October 2023, it was no longer quite that Ukraine was going to win, but that there was a stalemate and that the Russians were going to be exhausted. And again, we discussed this many times on the Duran. We have a whole year of narrative, which still you find still remnants of it in a few places that people are starting to doubt, that, the war is in a narrative, that the Russians are being gradually losing momentum, that they can't maintain the advance. And you mentioned General Kellogg, and I'd like to come to him now, because if you read his famous report of April 2024, which still seems to shape his thinking, he writes on the assumption that there is a stalemate underway in Ukraine, that the war is somehow in stalemate, and that it's going to remain there indefinitely unless the United States can somehow manage to persuade both sides to come together and to agree some kind of compromise, a freeze of the conflict and a ceasefire. And, that will basically be the end of the affair. It wasn't a stalemate in April 2024. Again, if you've been listening and reading the things that you've been saying, and which we were saying, you would know that. And it is not a stalemate now. But I think Kellogg still thinks it is. And I think he's telling Trump that. And I think the plan that he is forming is based on this completely false perspective. So we see how this narrative creation is shaping policy still. Just your comments.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, the problem is that, as you rightly said, this article of Kellogg was published end of April 2024. And of course, at that time, he could not know the two prerequisites that Vladimir Putin said on the 14th of June of last year. That means, A, that the four regions of the south and east of Ukraine must be under full control of Russia, and the promise that Ukraine would not join NATO as a prerequisite to enter negotiation. That was made clear by Putin. And the interesting thing is that despite having this major, because this is a major thing. I mean, when you hear Putin, and I know you have read the transcript of its address to the officials of the foreign ministry in June 2024, he made very clear these are the prerequisites, and this is not to be discussed. This is just the baseline for the discussion, meaning that everything you talk will be based on that period, meaning that coming back in some kind of plan where you may, for instance, say that you have a Russian sovereignty for 10 years or 20 years, and then that the oblasts or regions would be returned to Ukraine, or that Ukraine may be member of NATO in 10, 15, or 25 years, whatever. All that is basically excluded by Putin. But we still hear, I mean, less now than a few months ago, but still, we still hear those options for negotiation that we could put into on the table. But this is just excluded by Putin. The same as the peacekeepers. As you rightly pointed out in several programs, I mean, bringing troops to keep the peace in Ukraine. First, I have been head of the policy and doctrine of the peacekeeping operation in NATO for 2 years, so this is a subject I'm quite familiar with. When you send peacekeepers, as the name says, they are people who keep the peace. That means you need to have a peace first. But when you hear what France and Britain said, it's more people who are there to enforce the peace, to oblige Russia to go to the negotiation table, which is, technically speaking, it's not peacekeeping, it's peace enforcement, which is also a concept that we have in the United Nations. But it's another concept. And you can say, basically trying to enforce peace or forcing people to the negotiation table by using military force is in fact war fighting. That's what we have. But when we hear the Russians, I mean, they say, okay, if you bring your troops, no problem, we'll just destroy them. I mean, that's even what Medvedev used to say. He said to the French, yes, bring your guys, we'll destroy them. Meaning that we are not solving the problem. We are just kicking the can down the road by sending troops, because that will be just more people. And that's, I think Medvedev said something exactly like this, that bring troops in on the theater, that will be just more work for our artillery, that's all. But it will not change the nature of the conflict. So meaning that everything we propose and everything that comes up with Kellogg project, with quotation mark plan, and other plans that have been come to that, are not based on the reality that we see on the ground, first of all, and the reality that the Russians have outlined, because I think the Russians are much more realistic in describing the situation. And all the plans and ideas we have seen circulating in the last couple of weeks, they are not taking into account these factors. We always try to cheat the Russians by ignoring what they say. And at the end, that will come to a situation, almost the same kind of situation we had in June last year, when we had a peace plan where we no Russians to talk, because basically it was a peace plan based exclusively on what Zelensky had outlined on his 10 points plan. So we are heading, I hope, again, I cannot anticipate what will be published next week by the Kellogg and Trump. But what we have seen so far is, again, ideas that almost exclude what the Russians say, even though people start to understand that the Russians are serious and they're not bluffing. And if we don't take into account what they say, they will simply ignore any proposal for discussion and continue the war, which is at this stage totally detrimental to Ukraine, and people start to understand that. So again, this is what coming back to Kellogg, what surprised me is that since last June, he didn't really amend his proposal based on what the Russians said, which is quite surprising for someone who is there basically to shape some kind of policy to address the Ukrainian conflict. I don't know what you think about it.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that one of the great problems, I've said this, we've discussed this, I think in our previous program with you, is that we do not listen or even think very much about what the Russians are doing or thinking. We don't understand their strategy, which is what you've been writing about. We don't look at their way of war, and we don't listen very much to what they say diplomatically. We simply come along and we present them with our ideas and come away astonished when they say, no, this is not what we're thinking about. This isn't our ideas at all. It doesn't correspond. Now, there are reports in the United States that there is a division within the Trump administration about the war, that some people take a much more realistic view. They say that the war is lost, that the thing that the United States must do is walk away and extricate itself from it, and that there's nothing that can be done to turn it round. But there is said to be another view, which is Kellogg's, but also Mike Waltz's. He's the national security advisor, which says that the thing to do is to pressure the Russians, and that will somehow force the Russians into making concessions and will turn the situation around. Is there anything from a military point of view that can actually change the direction of the war at this stage? I mean, what realistically can the United States do to turn the situation around? The option of sending American troops to fight in Ukraine having been categorically ruled out in a way that I think it would be impossible to reverse. So what coercive pressure can be brought upon the Russians in military terms that could cause them to change their approach?
Well, that's exactly. I see your question. But it's almost a rhetorical question, because
it is absolutely. But I mean, I just wanted to hear you.
No. I understand. I understand that. But the thing is that how can you coerce the Russians when they have all the cards in hand? I mean, what are the cards that can be played by Ukraine at this stage? None. And that's probably the reason why we hear more and more. And recently, you had this interview with between Zelensky and this journalist, Morgan, Piers Morgan, when Zelensky asked for having new nuclear weapons, because he has no cards. Has no cards anymore. Yeah. And that's the reason why Zelensky is coming again and again with the Budapest Memorandum and these kind of things, which makes absolutely no sense at all. And the problem is that we left, in fact, by ignoring the Russians, especially in April 2022, as the West asked Zelensky to withdraw from the negotiation, although apparently the Ukrainian delegations had already signed the proposal that was on the table at that day. And the West, I mean, Boris Johnson and probably others, we'll talk about the Germans. I mean, if Putin mentioned the Germans and the French, but anyway, in any case, the Western powers asked Zelensky to withdraw from this agreement. And that was the last time in which Zelensky had really some cards to play. And he left the card, and now he has no cards anymore. I mean, there are probably some cards, but there were not even real cards in September and October 2022, as you had this offensive in the Kharkov region and in Kherson. But even there, I think it was not even defeats for the Russians, because the Russians withdrew from these places before the Ukrainians came in, and therefore it was not even a defeat. But this could have been used as a card. Instead, the Ukrainians got encouraged to launch their famous counteroffensive that failed in the summer 2023. But since then, there's absolutely no card to play for the Russians. So how can you coerce the the Russians. And that's exactly the problem. My view is that the current leadership in the US is still relying on some remnant of the narrative that we have talked about before, to some extent. They are still, and we have heard, I mean, you had recently a tweet from Donald Trump saying that the Russians were weakened, that their economy is failing and all that. How serious was he? I don't know. Well, it might have been some rhetoric in that too. But I think that for many people in Washington, they still have this idea that Russia is weakened and that there is not much behind the curtain, if you want, to support the military operation. That what we see is what we get, but beyond that, there is not much. And my personal view, as I understand your view, is also that, on the contrary, Russia has much more to offer than what it delivers on the ground. And if necessary, you can have much more capabilities or capacities that could be used, military capacities, but also economic capacities that could be used by the Russians if the war would expand, for instance. So I think there is a fundamental misconception in the West, including in the Trump administration, in order to approach a discussion with a realistic understanding of the situation. And we are still considering that they are weak, probably not as weak as we used to say, but still weak. The Ukrainians are weaker, okay? But probably there is NATO, if NATO, or probably not NATO, but if several countries would join Ukraine, they could probably turn the tide. And if we heard what Mark Rutte said recently, that he said that the West is strong enough or Ukraine will prevail, the problem is that just the war is not, the front line is not going in the right direction.
It's one of the most bizarre comments ever, actually.
Exactly. But so there is still this narrative that comes to the surface. So we haven't reached the point where people have definitely accepted that the Russians have all the cards in hand. We have absolutely no ways to exert some kind of pressure outside the silly idea of giving probably nuclear weapons to Ukraine. I don't remember. There was a European politician who suggested, I think it was a British, who suggested to have to give Ukraine nuclear weapons, but I don't remember. That was last year. Anyway, but beyond this, there's absolutely no card to play for the West. So we are deeper and deeper into the narrative. The problem is that when we assess what Trump is doing, I think it must be clear, in my view, that Trump is not a pacifist. He doesn't want peace. He just wants US out of this mess because he understands that this war is a black hole, that you just pour money into the hole and that disappears. However it disappears. It could be because of what happens on the ground, because of corruption, because of whatever. In any case, what the money you put on this conflict is lost, and definitely lost. And that goes exactly against what he wants to do, because he needs money to restore the grandeur of the United States. And to do that, he has to reconstruct an industrial power, industrial capacities. And to do that, he needs money. So putting money on conflicts that bring nothing it's just an economic calculus, in fact, that Trump is trying to do. So, but he doesn't want to how to say that? He doesn't want to make peace, but he doesn't want to leave the ground or to leave the theater of operation with the image of the one who has been defeated. He wants to have this image of to have some win, and that's probably why it comes with this issue of rare earth and minerals and all that, so that he can say, okay, we'll give you weapons. We don't care about what's happening in Ukraine. We get something that we need, because he needs those rare earths, because he needs to make his own supply chain more reliable, because China may always cut the supply of these rare earths and things like this. So it's again, we're leaving the Ukraine with this deal between rare earth and some weapons is good for us, and that's it. But I think that's the way we should understand that. But beyond that, I think Trump has understood that it's worthless to continue fighting.
I agree. I was just going to ask one very, very last question. I mean, we've now had people like Patrushev talking about the fact that Ukraine might not survive beyond the end of the year. What is your assessment of this? I mean, I'm not talking about any specific date, but if this war goes on indefinitely, given that the Russians are advancing, you know, the front line is moving in the wrong direction and all that. I mean, is it possible that the Ukrainian state could collapse? I've seen some commentaries that say that it absolutely is possible, but I would be interested to know your view.
Well, there are different factors that play here. First of all, of course, there is what's happening on the front line. The war, the actual war between Ukrainian and Russian forces in the Donbass. But there are also other things. Remember what Georgescu just said, the candidate to presidency in Romania. He said that the part of Romania, I mean, the Romanian part of Ukraine doesn't belong to Ukraine and should be recovered by Romania, for instance. So, and there have been some discussions since the very beginning of the conflict, that at one point you may have other countries claiming reclaiming the part of Ukraine where you have those minorities like the Magyar or Hungarian minority that has been mistreated for years. And Viktor Orban himself has complained several times to the Council of Europe because of the mistreatment of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. So you may have that. But beyond this, and probably related to that, you have also within Ukraine, I mean, the Ukrainian Ukraine, I mean, the Kievian Ukraine, you have discontent that develops. And I mentioned on another channel, I discussed this issue. You have partisan movements that develop on the whole territory of Ukraine. You have, of course, Russian partisans, especially in the Kherson region, the Kharkov and Nikolaev region. But these are Russian, ethnic Russians that are under Kiev, the rule of Kiev, and they are making some kind of resistance, something like similar to what you had in France during World War II. But beyond that, you also have Ukrainians who are taking arms against the government. And you have two kinds of resistance or partisan movements that develop right now in Ukraine. You have, of course, those who are resisting or trying to resist the forced recruitment that is ongoing in Ukraine. By the way, I remember the first, not the first, but one of the first video of Gonzalo Lira at the very beginning of the conflict. That was early March 2022. He was mentioning the forced recruitment already in Ukraine. So that means that the forced recruitment is not just something that happened just now. It's something that has happened since the beginning of the Russian operation. And you have the population that has systematically resisted to that. But now it converts into something that armed resistance with bombs. And you had, I think yesterday or the day before, you had people arrested in Kiev because they were trying to bomb or to destroy by bombing those trucks or vans of the recruitment officers and things like this. So you have that. And in addition to that, you have another kind of resistance that have started. This is the resistance against the government. So an armed resistance, armed opposition, if you want. And we see that these three components, Russians against recruitment and Ukrainian opposition, they are starting to merge slowly or to at least exchange information. And we know that, for instance, in Odessa, you have a movement which is called Dozor, which means watch, which is a Ukrainian movement, but it provides information to the Russian resistance. And when you may remember that a few days ago, you had a missile that came on one of the most famous hotels in Odessa, the Bristol Hotel, killing some foreigners there. The information came from these movements and was passed from Ukrainian movement to a Russian movement, and this movement transferred the information to the Russian military. And last week, you had several attempts in the northwest of Ukraine, in the region of Rovno or Rivne in Ukrainian, where you had several attempts to destroy the railways supply lines. And you know that this is you have a railway line that connects Poland to the center of Ukraine, and that's where you have a lot of transit of ammunition and armament and all that. And the resistance, which is purely Ukrainian, so it's not the Ukrainian opposition. So they started to attack those the railways and to make some bomb attacks against the transit convoys and things like that. In any case, it shows that something is changing within Ukraine itself. And you had, in the recent time, you had a lot of changes in the leadership and all that. That's probably related to that. And we have, in fact, something very similar to what we had in the Third Reich and the very end of the Third Reich, where you had all these units starting to have kind of independent life, if you want. And we have a very similar situation here. So that's, I think, when Patrushev mentioned the collapse of the Ukraine, it's not referring just to the military situation, but it's also referring to the domestic situation of Ukraine, which is, of course, influenced by the very poor economic situation. I mean, and especially if you have a cut in funds coming from the US, or let's say probably not completely cut, but at least the funds could be shortened. And that would mean some difficulties because Ukraine lives today exclusively on external aid, meaning that if this doesn't continue, then you will have a problem. And this cannot be eternal because we know, as you have yourself pointed out several times, you have budgetary problems in every European or at least a major. I mean, if you look at in European Union, you have the western part of European Union, the old Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld would say. Basically, these are the donors, and the eastern part of Ukraine are the recipient country, net recipient country from the European Union. Now, if you look at the donor side, that's essentially Italy, France, Germany, Belgium. They are net donors, in fact. And all these countries have currently a budget crisis, meaning that if you add to the current crisis the needs that would be required to make Ukraine surviving, I mean, that's unbearable. And that means that sooner or later, Ukraine will not have the necessary resources to continue functioning. So if you add all these factors, I mean, I don't know if it will be this year or next year or so, regardless of the situation, the military situation on the ground. But if we continue on that path, it's clear that Ukraine will not be a viable state. It's not even viable today. It's just viable because Western countries afford or try to afford to sustain this country. But in essence, this is not affordable in the long run. So yes, I think we can see that. But I think we have to take into account all these factors. I mean, the discontent, and we see also, if we see the polls and surveys that have been done by the Kiev Institute of Sociology, they publish every month a survey on the readiness of the population to support the government. We see that this support is decreasing every month. And today you have probably half of when we talk about Ukraine, we're talking obviously of the non-Russian Ukraine, but you barely have 50% of the population that is probably in line with the government, meaning that the rest of the population is not in line with the government. Some of them have probably taken arms in the armed opposition. Some probably do not make kind of armed opposition, but are probably passively opposed, meaning that in any case, the current path of the Ukrainian politics is not supported by an increasing part of the population. And at one point, this will come into, that will translate in some kind of change. And this change is probably not necessarily pro-Russian, but it's against current policy, the current Ukrainian policy. And at the end, and we see also that the readiness of the Ukrainian population to abandon those regions that are currently occupied by Russia. The portion of the population which is ready to abandon that is increasing. Meaning that, of course, in March 22, everybody was very gung-ho and no way we abandon those territories, we want to recover everything. But today, again, you have probably something like 50% who say, no, we need to have those territories. The rest of the population say, well, we're not sure that we need to recover that, and probably it's better to have peace in exchange of those territories, meaning that we are leaving, I mean, the population have a growing disconnect with what Zelensky is trying to do. And that goes in the direction of what Patrushev said.
Jacques Baud, Colonel Jacques Baud, thank you very much for answering all these questions in such a thorough and comprehensive way. Could you just wait a little while, because I'm sure my colleague Alex has a few questions to put to you from our audience. And as I said, we'll, from my side, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Colonel Baud, you have about 5-10 minutes to answer some questions from viewers?
Absolutely.
Great. From Nikos, Colonel Baud, you are one of my favorite guests on Colonel Davis's channel. You always understand the other side. Military Summary reported today that Russia is dragging Belarus into the war. Is it plausible?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, the Russians don't want to expand that, and they don't need that, first of all. I mean, what the Russians have on the ground is totally enough to sustain a future conflict. So they don't need to have the Belarus. But Belarus becomes a strategic ally because In fact, it covers the northern flank of the Ukrainian theater of operation. And therefore, and in Europe, this is probably the most reliable ally of Russia. So that's why Russia wants definitely to keep Belarus. At the same time, we remember that last year, Vladimir Putin said he would deploy, or better said, station nuclear weapons in Belarus. So that's still part of this alliance that you have between the two countries. But I don't think that there is any willingness or any intent to involve Belarus in the conflict in any way. They don't want to extend that. There is no need for that. So.
Okay. Matthew says NATO should have been dismantled in 1991 because there was no threat to NATO after 1991. Your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. I think the thing is that NATO was built, first of all, as Jens Stoltenberg used to say, it's a nuclear alliance. It was built around US nuclear power. In essence, NATO is just an alliance that makes European countries under the nuclear umbrella of the US. And that's the reason why the US is still a primus inter pares into the NATO system. And that's why the US still keeps this predominance in NATO. But in essence, and NATO was created just after they discovered that Soviet Union had its own nuclear weapon. That's made the European countries to freak out and to have the Washington Treaty in April 1949. But essentially, NATO was built as a bloc against the Soviet Union that was considered, even if Warsaw Pact didn't exist formally at this time, it was still considered as a bloc, because at that time, I mean 1949, the military establishment of the different East European countries were communist. Most of them were communist, and therefore related very strongly to Moscow. It was formalized, if you want, with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, but in essence, the NATO was designed as a bloc against another bloc. As the Warsaw Pact dissolved in 1991, there was no point to have NATO, in fact. And the vision, I think the vision of the Russians at that time was much more mature than the Western view. The Soviets already at that time had this idea of security by cooperation instead of security by confrontation. By the way, when I say security through cooperation, you hear more or less what used to be during the Cold War the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that it originated from a Soviet idea that turned out to be now what we know today as the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was the idea of the Soviet and the Russians, that instead of having two confronting blocs, we should ensure security by just having good relations with each other. That's security by cooperation. And that's the reason why, even during the 50s, I mean the 1950s, the Soviets tried, or they explored the idea of being part of NATO, and they asked informally to NATO to belong to NATO, because they always had this idea that instead of being two blocs looking at each other and preparing weapons and being ready for confrontation, it would be more fruitful to cooperate together. And there are probably mutual benefits for that. And they revived this idea as the communism disappeared in the early 90s, and there were some attempts for the Russians to join NATO. And I remember because we had similar thoughts in Switzerland at that time, and Switzerland was contemplating in the early 90s to join this concept of partnership for peace. And I was part of a delegation that went to different actors to explore how the neutrality of Switzerland would be perceived if Switzerland would join the Partnership for Peace. And we went to Moscow, and I had the opportunity to talk to the highest leadership of the Ministry of Defense in Russia at the time, generals and politicians as well, to explore that. And we could feel at that time that the Russians genuinely were exploring and contemplating the idea that we could coexist absolutely peacefully. There is nothing that opposes us. During the Cold War, you could say, okay, Marxism, communism, or you can put all the words you want, was there were two different words, or two different, as we say in German, Weltanschauungen. So this is a perception of the world, in fact, that was on both sides, and you could explain why you had this antagonism. But after the fall of the communism, Russia had not really a different view of the world than we had in Europe or even the US. The US is probably to put apart because they have an hegemonic view that the Europeans don't have really, or no longer. And that's why the Russians were ready to join NATO, not because they wanted to join a military organization, but because they thought that, in fact, we can ensure cooperation, security by cooperating better with each other in economic terms, in political terms, in military terms, in everything. So, and on several occasions, by the way, during the Afghan war or things like that, you could have imagined a cooperation between Russia and the United States, for instance. This is, there are a lot of opportunity to cooperate in terms of security, to fight terrorism and things like this. So there is no need to have a bloc. And the problem is that NATO has not understood that. Even though, to be honest, I used to work for a while. I was researcher for a very short time in the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And I had some friends there, and I met them again when I was in NATO. And a good friend of mine is responsible for the future of NATO. And we had several discussions together. And they realize, at this working level, I would say, they realize that NATO is outdated in its essence. And there's a lot of people within NATO who thinks that. I think, again, we have a disconnect between the working level and the political level of the organization, if you want. And with the contact I have with people, my peers, if you want, in NATO, which were colonel and equivalent, or civilian equivalent, a lot of people said NATO, as it is designed, is no longer the right organization to ensure security. The problem is that with this conflict in Ukraine, this has reinvigorated the idea, this bloc idea. And there is a point that needs to be mentioned when we talk about NATO, is that, as I said before, you have the old Europe and the new Europe. Remember that when Jacques Chirac opposed the idea of the US to go into Iraq in 2003, Rumsfeld mentioned the new Europe that was in favor of joining the US in Iraq. And the new Europe, what is the new Europe? And those who joined the US in this conflict were Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, and all that. This is the new Europe. And this new Europe is vigorously anti-Russian. And to some extent, and I was surprised when I was in NATO to see the political weight these countries have in the mindset of NATO. Even though a lot of countries, I mean, you know, for Portugal or Spain, they have no problem with Russia, essentially. Their challenges are in the south of the Mediterranean. This is not Eastern Europe. And the same for Italy, for instance. But the thing is that those Baltic states and Poland have very strong ties with the US. You know, I remember during the Cold War, when I was for discussions on the State Department in Washington, when we go in the building of the State Department, you have a huge hall at the entrance where you have all the flags of the world, all the countries. And during the Cold War, you had hanging on the roof, you had the 3 flags of the Baltic states. I mean, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They kept those flags, meaning that the ties between the US and those Baltic states is extremely strong. And today, in fact, those Baltic states help the US policy when it comes to this the policy again, or the politics, or the strategy, or whatever you call it, against Russia. And that, in my view, is a bad influence or bad evolution of NATO. But it's a fact. I mean, I fully agree that NATO, in the form it is now, should disappear and be replaced by something which is more cooperative, more inclusive in terms of countries, and that would help everybody, because we spend a lot of money for nothing. And if you go even now with this requirement of 5% of GDP for defense, I mean, what for? I mean, what for? How can you define? I remember even in NATO, by the way, when I was there between 2012 and 2017. And even at that time, people were questioning who is the enemy, you know? So this is a real question. And we have the same question in Switzerland, for instance. We have an army, but what exactly for? Because what is the enemy? Germany? Italy, France, Austria? We don't know. So, but we need an army. So this is no question. The problem is that how can we justify an increase in the defense budget if we don't have a concrete threat? And we see now with the budgetary crisis we have mentioned before that we are in some kind of dead end, because we want to increase defense spending, but what for exactly? Everybody understands that the conflict we have in Ukraine is a Ukrainian conflict. It's not something that will come. I mean, again, the narrative will tell you that after Ukraine, it will be the rest of Europe and things like this. But nobody really believes that, especially not the taxpayers don't believe that. And that's why what you have with the AfD in Germany and several parties in other countries who question the intellectual ability of our leaders to accept this kind of fancy threats. The problem is that it has consequences. And we create an enemy just for funding defense budget. For what? It would be much effective to have something which is based on cooperation, that we stop this confrontational type of ideology, and we start to understand that it's probably beneficial to everybody starts cooperating in in Europe, which in essence was the lessons of World War II.
Soapy Orc says, as a former U.S. infantry officer and Afghan combat vet, I am surprised at all the West got the intel analysis wrong. We never understood Afghans. We would never be able to think like a Russian.
Well, that's interesting. It's a very interesting comment because I've been in Afghanistan. I remember when I was in Afghanistan, I had a driver provided to me, and this guy was a Pashtun, which is essentially the same tribe as the original Taliban. And at one point, I asked him, "What do you feel about the Taliban? How do you feel about them?" I told me, we don't like the Taliban. But if we have to choose between the Westerners and the Taliban, we will choose the Taliban. Everything was said there. And as a matter of fact, when we talk about the Afghan conflict, and you have a lot of people trying to make comparisons between the Russian war and the NATO war in Afghanistan, there's a very strong difference, because I followed the Afghan war because at that time I was in the intelligence. I was in touch with Ahmed Shah Massoud. I even wrote a handbook for him at that time, especially to fight against these the small butterfly mines that were dropped by the Soviets. And I wrote a handbook, How to Disarm Mines and things like this. Anyway, so I followed this conflict in Afghanistan. But the Russians, in fact, never tried to occupy Afghanistan. They never tried to get a control over the whole of Afghanistan. Their task was simply to keep the government active, in fact, to preserve the government. And what the Soviets did at that time, if you look at the deployment of the Soviets in Afghanistan, they never tried to go deep into the mountains and all that. They just tried to keep the major communication axes under control and the major cities. That's all. And they succeeded in that. And in fact, when the Soviets left in 1989, the government they protected for several years, or 10 years, this government was kept in activity for additional 2 years, while the NATO tried to impose a government. And this government that they imposed, it lasted only 24 hours after the American left. Because that was the idea, to impose a governance in Afghanistan. The Soviets didn't really do that. I mean, they just protected the government from those rebels that were at that time funded by the US in an attempt to destabilize the outskirts of the Soviet Union. In fact, that was the name of the game. And the task of the Soviets was very limited, and they did well. In fact, I mean, there were probably a lot of crimes committed, and they probably had a lot of losses. All that is probably true. But if we look at the result at the end, they were more effective, probably not efficient, but effective in doing their task than the NATO. I mean, if we look at the amount of money we poured into Afghanistan, the people that we had to, because when we talk about the losses in Afghanistan, we talk about the losses on the ground. I mean, military, uniformed people on the ground. But we tend to ignore all the civilians that died in this conflict. And we also ignore all those who committed suicide back home when they came. I mean, in the last 20 years in which the US was involved in both in Afghanistan and Iraq, the American lost, I think, on the ground, they lost like something like 3,500 people on the ground. But at home, those veterans who committed suicide are between 6,500 and 7,000 who committed every year suicide. In 20 years, you can imagine the number of casualties of the war you had. So meaning that, yes, the Soviets, in fact, understood better the situation than the Westerners. Their intelligence about let's say, the strategic understanding of the conflict was much better. And their understanding of the conflict translated much quicker into structural changes in the Soviet army. I mean, the Soviets entered in 1979 in Afghanistan with the 40th Army. That was an army based in Turkestan military district at that time. This 40th Army was composed with tanks, infantry vehicle, and all that. I mean, the usual structure of an army, a general army, as the Russians call it, in Afghanistan. But 2 years later, this army was completely restructured. You had no tanks anymore, almost no longer APCs or tracked APCs anymore. You had wheeled APCs because they can better cope with landmine on the ground. You had helicopters, special forces, radio, and artillery. So it was completely restructured. And that shows also how the Soviets were able to adjust their structure to the situation instead of getting closed into kind of a formal understanding of the conflict. And if you go today in Afghanistan, and I was surprised when I was in Afghanistan, I was there in 2008, 2009. I was on several occasions in Afghanistan for a project with the European Union. But in any case, I was surprised to see at that time how the Russians were still respected in Afghanistan. And when I talked to some academics at that time in Afghanistan, and they told us, we cannot forgive the Westerners for what they do. We could forgive to the US or the Americans because they are stupid and they don't understand us. But we cannot forget to the British because they know us and they understand us. So there is, and on the Russians, they were much more open because they felt that the Russians understood. And on several occasions, you had Afghanistan asking the Russians to mediate with the NATO, in fact, when during the NATO time. And I was invited to some discussions in the OSCE in Vienna, where you had, as a matter of fact, the Russian ambassador that was invited as a mediator in the issues that were confronting both NATO and the Afghan population. So yes, in fact, the Russians, we tend to underestimate their ability to understand people. We still have this image of this extremely rigid, doctrinal, ideological posture of the military, of politicians and all that. But when you go deeper into the study, you will see that they are much more subtle in their approach to conflict. They understand the situation much better than we do. They don't have this kind of self-confidence that Westerners do have. And in fact, even if we have probably intellectual capabilities to understand others, those capabilities are denied by the fact that we feel superior. the Russians never feel superior. There is a kind of a healthy humility when you talk to Russians that makes them more receptive to other views, and so they can understand because they are ready to accept other views, which we are not as Westerners. It's about a little bit, I think our common culture of the West. I mean, we can say, I come from Switzerland, and I think Switzerland it's smaller than other countries, but it's not very different from others. Because we have a nice democracy, because we have a high standard of living, because this and because that, we feel that we have some kind of superiority towards others. And that makes us very arrogant when we start addressing issues in areas such as Middle East, Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and all that. And that makes us, let's say, waterproof to other cultures, because we think we have the truth. And therefore, they have to listen to us and not the opposite. And when you work in intelligence, your posture should be exactly the opposite. You should be learning. Every occasion is an occasion to learn. And you don't learn by talking. You learn by listening. And that, I think, the Russians have understood. And that's why, in fact, when you read, you see their political decision that most probably reflect their intelligence assessment of the situation. You see that they have a much, much healthier understanding of situation, both at strategic, operational, and tactical level than we do, because they don't have this sense of superiority that we have. And it's interesting since I'm on the field of intelligence, when we talk about this conflict in Ukraine, we see that all intelligence services in the West have been kind of instrumentalized to convey the narrative. They have been used or mobilized to make the narrative credible. In fact, they became some kind of propaganda outlet and not intelligence organization. I mean, an intelligence organization must be absolutely candid, not naive, but candid, meaning that it had to understand the situation as it is, without any prejudice, without any preconceived ideas. It should look at the reality as it is, the naked reality, and that's what it should portray to the decision makers. The problem is that we are in a world, especially in the West, where everybody has to be exactly on the same wavelength. And if the politician thinks that the way is A, then the intelligence has to say it's A. But this is not how the world works. And we are seeing now that we are again, as we said at the very beginning of this program, that the reality now is confronting the narrative, and we have a gap between the two. That's exactly comes from that. It's a lack of proper and integer intelligence.
Colonel Jacques Baud, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for answering questions from the viewers. I have the link to Colonel Baud's book in the description box down below. I will also add it as a pinned comment. Thank you so much.
And may I also add my thanks, and also for this actually very interesting account about the Afghan situation as well, which I've learned a lot from.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with Darren and with your team today. Thank you.
Pleasure having you. Thank you.